The Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard that does not keep receipts. It swallows kings and paupers alike, entirely indifferent to the coins in their pockets. In September of 1857, the famous Ship of Gold vanished into the throat of a hurricane, taking 3 tons of California bullion and 400 souls down into the dark. History usually remembers the treasure. It remembers the panic of the banks in New York and the frantic search for the sunken millions, but it almost forgot the woman. While strong men strapped belts of gold dust to their waists and sank like stones into the abyss, a passenger named Addie Easton did something that defies the laws of economics and survival. She found herself alone in the churning waste of the storm, clinging to the very cargo that had doomed the ship. She didn't spend the gold, she didn't hoard it, she lashed her body to it. For the next hour, I want you to turn down the lights and settle in. We are not just going to recount a shipwreck. We are going to drift alongside a woman floating in the void, clinging to $1 million of cold, hard iron, waiting for a dawn that might never come. This is a story about the crushing weight of wealth and the terrifying buoyancy of the human spirit. Welcome to the deep. The Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard that does not keep receipts. It swallows kings and paupers alike, entirely indifferent to the coins in their pockets. In September of 1857, the famous Ship of Gold vanished into the throat of a hurricane, taking 3 tons of California bullion and 400 souls down into the dark. History usually remembers the treasure. It remembers the panic of the banks in New York and the frantic search for the sunken millions. But it almost forgot the woman. While strong men strapped belts of gold dust to their waists and sank like stones into the abyss, a passenger named Addie Easton did something that defies the laws of economics and survival. She found herself alone in the churning waste of the storm, clinging to the very cargo that had doomed the ship. She didn't spend the gold. She didn't hoard it. She lashed her body to it. For the next hour, I want you to turn down the lights and settle in. We are not just going to recount a shipwreck. We are going to drift alongside a woman floating in the void, clinging to $1 million of cold, hard iron, waiting for a dawn that might never come. This is a story about the crushing weight of wealth and the terrifying buoyancy of the human spirit. Welcome to the deep. The ocean does not bargain. It does not sign contracts. It does not recognize the seal of a bank, or the sovereignty of a nation, or the desperate prayers of a mother. It is a vast, cold indifference, and in the middle of that indifference, on a swelling grey morning in September, bobbing in the aftermath of a violence the world had rarely seen, there was a woman. Her name was Anselina, though the few people who knew her called her Addie. She was floating in a void, where the horizon had been erased by mist and spray, a single speck of biology in a universe of geology. To understand the absurdity of her position, you have to look closely at what was keeping her afloat. It was not a piece of driftwood. It was not a carefully crafted cork life preserver, though she had worn one hours ago. Beneath her arms, bruising her ribs with every heave of the Atlantic swell, was a wooden crate reinforced with iron bands. A crate designed to sink. A crate designed to sit on the floor of a vault in New York City or in the belly of a treasury. It was a chest of gold. There is a terrible irony in this image. A human life, fragile and freezing, clinging to the very object that had dragged 300 other souls to the bottom of the sea. The weight that drowns is the only thing holding her up. Around her, the water is thick with the debris of ambition. Splintered mahogany from the first-class dining saloon, silk top hats filled with salt water, unopened letters, and everywhere the gold. It was a fortune that could build cities, scattered like trash on the surface of the deep. But in this moment, under the grey canopy of a dying hurricane, the value of gold had shifted. It was no longer currency. It was merely wood and buoyancy. It was a raft. This is not a story about treasure hunting. We have enough of those. This is a story about the moment when the systems we build to protect our wealth collide with the chaos of the natural world. It is the story of how a steamship, a marvel of the industrial age, became a tomb, and how one woman, Addie Easton, found herself alone in the churning graveyard, holding on to the heavy, deadly ambition of an empire. To understand how she ended up there, drifting on a chest of bullion, we have to go back. We have to rewind the storm. We have to pull the clouds apart and calm the waves. We have to go back to the dock where the sun is shining and the world feels permanent. Addie Easton was not a titan of industry. She was not a banker. If you look at the passenger manifest today, scanning the faded cursive ink preserved in maritime archives, her name does not jump out at you. She appears simply as a passenger, traveling with her husband, Frank. They were part of a migration, a great shifting of people that defined the middle of the 19th century. They were returning from California. In 1857, California was not just a place, it was an idea. It was the end of the rainbow. People went there to dig, to scrape, to suffer, and if they were lucky, to leave. Addie and Frank were the lucky ones. They were coming home. They were not incredibly wealthy, not like the tycoons who owned the shipping lines, but they had succeeded. They had played the game of the gold rush, and they had survived it. Now they were trading the dust and the mud of the West for the cobblestones and established order of the East. When we look at her portrait, or at least the sketches that survive of women of her station from that time, we see a certain resolve. The stiff high collars, the hair parted severely down the middle, the eyes that look past the painter. Addie was a woman of the Victorian era, which meant she lived in a world designed by men for men. She moved through spaces that were built to accommodate the ambitions of her husband, or her father, or the captains of industry. She was a passenger in her own life, carried along by currents she could not control. She boarded the ship not as an adventurer, but as a wife. She trusted the ticket, she trusted the schedule. There is a specific kind of faith required to step onto a ship. You hand over your life to a machine. You assume that the rivets are tight, that the coal is dry, that the captain is sober, and that the ocean will behave. Addie Easton walked up the gangplank with her skirts held high to avoid the dock grime, believing in the promise of the ticket, that she would arrive in New York. She did not know that she was stepping into a math equation that had already been solved against her. But the ship was not really built for Addie. She was cargo, just like the mail bags and the coal. The ship was built for something else entirely. It was built for the metal. The vessel was the SS Central America, but the newspapers called it the Ship of Gold. And that was not a nickname. It was a job description. In the bowels of the ship, deep below the waterline, far beneath the cabins where Addie and Frank unpacked their trunks, sat the true purpose of the voyage. There were tons of it. Literally, tons. 3 tons of gold. It came in every form imaginable. There were heavy stamped ingots, brick-sized bars that shone with a dull, heavy luster. There were bags of fresh minted double eagle coins, $20 pieces with the face of liberty staring out, unblemished. And there was the dust. Pokes and sacks of raw gold dust swept from the sluice boxes of the Sierra Nevada, labeled with the names of miners who would never see it again. This cargo was not just wealth, it was the lifeblood of the American economy. In 1857, the banks in New York were trembling. Credit was tight. Businesses were failing. The country was holding its breath, waiting for this shipment. This gold was the transfusion that would keep the heart of commerce beating. The insurance ledgers for this voyage are staggering. The declared value was over $1 million in 1857 currency, a number so large it feels abstract. In today's terms, hundreds of millions. Because of this, the security was absolute. There were armed guards. There were reinforced storage lockers. The ship was a floating vault. The logic of the shipping line was simple: protect the gold. The passengers were important, yes, because they paid fares. But the gold was existential. If the passengers were late, they would complain. If the gold was late, banks would collapse. So as the stevedores loaded those heavy chests, grunting under the weight, sweating in the tropical heat of the transfer point in Havana, they were loading the anchor that would doom the voyage. They placed the heaviest items at the bottom, centering the gravity, creating a dense core of wealth. They did not know that they were loading the very things that would become shrapnel in a few days' time. They did not know that the weight of this gold would dictate every decision made on the bridge. When you carry a kingdom's ransom, you do not turn back for bad weather. You push through, you protect the asset. The Atlantic Ocean in September is a deceptive beast. It is the height of hurricane season, a time when the warm waters of the equator act as a fuel injection system for the atmosphere. Heat rises, pressure drops, and the rotation of the Earth spins the air into a frenzy. The captains of the era knew this. Captain William Herndon, the man commanding the Central America, knew this better than anyone. He was a Navy man, an explorer of the Amazon, a man of science and discipline. He knew the charts. He knew the terrifying geometry of a cyclone. But he also knew the schedule. Meteorology in the 1850s was not a predictive science. It was an observational one. There were no satellites looking down from space, no radar sweeps painting red blobs on a screen. You knew a storm was coming when the sky turned a bruised purple. You knew it was bad when the barometer, the glass as they called it, began to fall. And on this voyage the glass did not just fall, it plummeted. It started with a change in the light. The sharp, tropical sunlight of the Caribbean began to fade into a milky, oppressive haze. The air grew heavy, sticky with humidity. It felt static. Birds, which usually trailed the wake of the steamer hoping for scraps, vanished. The horizon, usually a crisp line between blue and blue, blurred into a grey smudge. On the bridge, the officers spoke in hushed tones. They watched the mercury in the barometer drop notch by notch. They were doing the calculus of risk. If they slowed down, they burned more coal for less distance. If they tried to outrun it, they risked structural damage. But there was a pervasive arrogance in the mid-19th century. This was the age of steam. Man had conquered nature. We had built iron horses to cross the plains and steam leviathans to cross the deep. There was a belief that a ship like this, with its massive paddle wheels and roaring furnaces, could simply plow through whatever the atmosphere decided to throw at it. So the order was given to maintain speed. The black smoke poured from the funnels, leaving a dark scar across the darkening sky. Down in the boiler rooms, men shoveled coal into the fires, the orange glow illuminating their sweat-streaked faces, powering the pistons that drove the ship directly into the throat of the monster. Life aboard the ship, in those final hours of calm, was a study in denial. The first-class dining saloon was a theater of civilization. Crystal glasses tinkled against fine china. Stewards in white jackets poured wine. Men smoked cigars in the lounge, discussing politics, the price of land in San Francisco, the future of the Union. Addie Easton would have been part of this world. We can imagine her sitting at a dinner table, perhaps feeling the first subtle roll of the ship as the swell increased, clutching the stem of her glass to keep it steady. She might have exchanged a glance with her husband, Frank. A silent question, is it getting rougher? And he, playing the role of the stoic protector, would have reassured her. It's just a squall, Addie. The captain knows his business. There is a comfort in the machinery of travel. The rhythmic thumping of the paddle wheels, the vibration of the deck plates. It feels like a heartbeat. It tells you that everything is working. It lulls you into believing that the environment outside the hull doesn't matter. Inside there is light. There is warmth. There is dinner. But beneath the floorboards the ship was already groaning. The Central America was a side-wheel steamer. It was not a sleek, steel-hulled vessel like the ships that would come later. It was made of wood. It was essentially a massive canoe with a steam engine dropped in the middle. And like all wooden ships, it worked because it was flexible. It moved with the waves. But flexibility has a limit. As the passengers slept in their bunks, the wind began to rise. It started as a whistle in the rigging, then a moan, and finally a scream. The ocean began to stand up. These were not waves. They were moving mountains of water. And in the darkness of the cargo hold, the gold chests sat in their racks, heavy and silent, waiting for the moment when gravity would shift. The transition from a rough voyage to a disaster is often not a single event, but a cascade. It happened slowly, then all at once. For Addie, it likely began with the sound. Imagine the sound of a hurricane at sea. It is not just wind, it is a physical pressure. It presses against your eardrums, it tears the breath from your lungs. And then, the water. Water smashing against wood with the force of a cannonball. The ship pitched. It didn't just roll, it lurched, diving into troughs so deep the sky disappeared, then struggling up the face of the next wave, the paddle wheels spinning wildly in the air before slamming back down with a bone-jarring shudder. In the cabins, luggage became missiles. Trunks slid across the floor, smashing into bulkheads. Pitchers of water shattered. People were thrown from their bunks. The illusion of civilization vanished in seconds. The dining saloon, once a place of elegance, was now a debris field of broken glass and overturned tables. Addie and the other women were ordered to stay in their cabins, but staying put was impossible when the floor was tilting at 45 degrees. Fear, cold and sharp, took hold. This was not seasickness. This was the primal realization that the barrier between the warm, dry world of the human and the freezing, chaotic world of the fish was breaking down. And then, the sound that no sailor ever wants to hear. The sound of water where water should not be. It wasn't splashing over the deck. It was rising from below. The hull, twisting and flexing in the grip of the hurricane, had begun to open its seams. The oak planks, hammered together by men in a dry dock years ago, were pulling apart. The ocean was forcing its way in, but the most terrifying sound came from the cargo hold. As the ship rolled violently to port, something gave way. The restraints on the gold chests snapped. 3 tons of metal, the pride of the California banks, broke loose. Imagine the noise of heavy iron-bound chests sliding across a wooden deck, smashing into the ribs of the ship. It was the sound of a battering ram. The gold was no longer cargo. It was an internal enemy. It was smashing the ship to pieces from the inside out. The very wealth they were protecting was now helping the storm destroy them. Addie Easton, clutching her husband's arm in the dim light of a flickering lantern, could feel the change. The ship felt different. It felt heavy. It felt sluggish. The rhythmic heartbeat of the engine faltered. The vibrations stopped. The fires in the boiler room were being doused by rising water. The pumps were failing. The ship of gold was dying. And out in the darkness, the hurricane was just getting started. The grand ambition of the voyage, the secure transport of capital, was about to be dismantled by the crude, brutal physics of the sea. And Addie Easton, the passenger, the wife, the woman who just wanted to go home, was about to be cast into a nightmare where the only rule was survival and the only life raft was a box of gold. When the engines died, the ship lost its voice. For days, the Central America had been a living thing, vibrating with the pulse of steam and fire. It roared, it hissed, it fought. But when the water rose high enough in the boiler room to touch the furnaces, the end came not with a bang, but with a hiss. A great, long exhalation of steam, like a dying whale surrendering its last breath. And then, silence. Well, not true silence. The storm outside was still screaming. The wind was still tearing the tops off the waves, creating a slurry of white foam that filled the air like horizontal rain. But inside the hull, the mechanical heart had stopped. And in that sudden, terrifying quiet, every passenger knew the truth. The machine had failed. The promise of the industrial age, that steel and fire could conquer the elements, had been broken. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a heavy, dead object, wallowing in the trough of the sea. Without power, it could not keep its bow into the wind. It swung broadside, exposing its long, vulnerable flank to the mountains of water rolling in from the dark. Every wave that hit the side felt like a collision with a train. The timbers groaned. The iron rivets screamed under the shearing force. Captain Herndon, a man whose face had gone grey with the weight of 500 lives, made the only decision left. He turned the passengers into the engine. If the pumps wouldn't work by steam, they would work by muscle. A bucket brigade was formed. It was a scene from Dante. Men in soaking tuxedos, miners in flannel shirts, bankers and deckhands. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the rising water of the lower decks. They passed buckets of water up the line, hand over hand, hour after hour. It was a desperate rhythmic chant of survival. Dip, pass, dip, pass. They were trying to empty the Atlantic Ocean with buckets. Addie Easton stood apart from this. The women and children had been ordered to the saloon on the upper deck. It was an attempt at chivalry, an attempt to shield them from the brutal reality unfolding below. But you cannot shield someone from the angle of the floor. Addie felt the deck tilting. She watched the water creeping up the stairs, black and oily, swirling with the debris of the ship's bowels. She watched her husband, Frank, join the line. He was just another pair of hands now. His status, his plans for their new home in the East, his memories of the California sun, none of it mattered. He was a biological machine, burning the last of his energy to buy the ship a few more minutes of buoyancy. There was a moment of hope, brief and cruel. A small brig, the Marine, was spotted through the breaks in the storm. It was a tiny vessel tossed like a cork, but it was there. It was floating. Captain Herndon ordered the women and children to the lifeboats to be transferred to the rescuing ship. But the ocean does not cooperate with orderly evacuations. The lifeboats were heavy, wooden, clinker-built craft, swinging wildly on their davits. As the Central America rolled, the boats smashed against the side of the hull, splintering oars and cracking gunwales. Lowering them into the churning chaos below was a suicide mission. Some boats made it into the water. Women were lowered on ropes, screaming as the cold spray hit them, swinging over the abyss. Sailors in the small boats tried to catch them, timing the rise and fall of the swell, a 20-foot vertical difference in seconds. It was a nightmare of physics. Addie Easton watched this. We do not know exactly why she did not go. Perhaps the boats were full. Perhaps she was frozen by the terror of that leap. Or perhaps in the chaos she was simply separated from the herd. But the result was the same. The Marine drifted away, damaged by the storm, unable to take more. The lifeboats that had launched were gone, swallowed by the mist. Addie was left behind. She stood on the deck of the dying Leviathan. She was surrounded by men who had stopped bailing. They knew it was over. The water in the hold had equalized with the sea outside. The ship was settling. There is a specific horror in the final moments of a shipwreck. It is the realization that the solid ground beneath your feet is about to become a liquid grave. Men began to pray. Some broke into the spirit lockers and drank heavily, choosing anesthesia over salvation. Others, the miners, strapped their belts of gold dust around their waists. It was a final, fatal instinct. They believed that if they survived, they would need their money. They did not understand that the gold was an anchor. They were strapping stones to their own bodies. Addie did not have gold. She had only her heavy Victorian dress, layers of petticoats and wool that would soak up water and drag her down. She stood near the rail, gripping the cold, wet wood. The sun had set, or perhaps the storm clouds were just that thick. The world was a monochrome of violent grey. Then the Central America gave up. It didn't slide gracefully. It fell. The bow dropped and the stern rose, lifting the massive red paddle wheels out of the water for the first time. The sound was deafening, the groan of twisting metal, the explosion of trapped air bursting through the decks, the screams of hundreds of men sliding down the impossible slope. Addie was thrown. The deck vanished from under her boots. One moment she was standing on a monument to human engineering. The next, she was falling into the hurricane. The water hit her like a sledgehammer. It was shockingly, paralyzingly cold. It drove the air from her lungs. She went down, tumbling in the vortex created by the sinking ship. The suction of a vessel that size is immense. It pulls everything down with it. Addie spun in the darkness, water forcing its way into her nose and mouth. She was drowning. This was the end. This was the statistic she was about to become. But then the turbulence spat her out. Her petticoats, trapping air, acted as a crude buoyancy vest. She broke the surface, gasping, coughing up brine, her eyes stinging. She was in a valley of death. The waves were towering walls of water that blocked out the sky, then crashed down with the weight of a building. Around her, the surface was a churning soup of wreckage, shattered planks, barrels, doors ripped from their hinges, and bodies, hundreds of them. The sea was thick with the floating dead and the drowning living. Voices cried out in the darkness. Names, prayers, curses. Addie thrashed, her heavy skirts tangling around her legs. She needed something to hold. Her hands clawed at the water, striking debris, slipping off wet wood. She was tiring. The cold was already seeping into her muscles, turning her blood to slush. Then, her hand struck something solid, something square, something heavy. It was a crate. It was low in the water, barely breaking the surface, but it was stable. It didn't roll like the round barrels. It possessed a strange, dense inertia. Addie lunged for it, wrapping her arms around the rough wood. It dipped slightly under her weight, but pushed back. It held her up. She didn't know what it was. In the dark, in the chaos, it was just a shape. She scrambled to get a better grip, hooking her elbows over the top. She felt the iron bands reinforcing the corners. She felt the heavy grain of the wood. Another wave smashed into her, burying her for a terrifying 10 seconds. She held on with a strength she didn't know she possessed. When she surfaced, coughing, she was still holding the crate. It was only later, during a flash of lightning that illuminated the heaving seascape, that she might have realized what she was holding. Or perhaps she didn't realize it until the dawn. But we know what it was. The manifest tells us. The salvage records tell us. She was clinging to a treasure chest. Inside that wooden shell were bars of gold, or heavy sacks of coins. The irony is perfect and terrible. The men who had strapped gold to their waists had sunk like stones, but this chest, this concentrated block of capital, displaced just enough water to float. The cargo that had doomed the ship was now the only thing keeping Addie Easton from the bottom. Night fell completely. It was a darkness so absolute it felt solid. The cries of the other survivors began to fade. One by one, the voices were silenced by the cold or the waves. The ocean was cleaning up the mess. Addie was alone. This is a specific kind of loneliness that modern humans can scarcely imagine. We are used to lights. We are used to the hum of electricity. We are used to the presence of others. Addie was floating in a void, suspended over miles of black water, holding onto a box of metal. She lost all sense of direction. There was no north, no south. There was only up toward the air and down toward the silence. Every wave was a battle. She had to anticipate the rise, take a breath, hold it as the water crashed over her, and then fight to keep her head above the foam in the trough. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time dissolves in trauma. Her body began to go numb. The pain in her arms, screaming from the effort of gripping the crate, dulled into a remote ache. She was drifting into hypothermia. In the middle of the night, something bumped against her. She cried out, thinking it was a shark or a monster from the deep, but it was wood, another crate. The wreckage was clustering. The currents were bringing the debris together. Addie, driven by an instinct she couldn't articulate, reached out and grabbed the second crate. Now she had two. She realized through the fog of her freezing mind that she couldn't hold on forever. Her hands were claws frozen into hooks. If she passed out, she would let go and she would sink. She needed to become part of the wreckage. She struggled with her clothing. Her shawl, a sash, anything she could rip or untie. Her fingers were clumsy, unresponsive blocks of meat. But desperation is a powerful engine. She managed to loosen a length of fabric. With agonizing slowness, working in the pitch black, timing her movements between the crashing waves, she lashed the two crates together. Then, she lashed herself to them. She tied the fabric around her waist and looped it through the iron handles of the chests. She was now mechanically attached to the gold. She had merged with the cargo. This saved her life, but it also tortured her. The sea is never still. The crates were heavy, dense objects. They did not ride the waves like a cork, they plowed through them. They jerked and snapped with the violence of the water. Addie was the soft biological link between two massive heaving weights. Every time a wave hit, the crates smashed together. They pinched her skin. They bruised her ribs. The gold was beating her. It was a brutal physical assault. The wealth was extracting a toll for its protection. As the night wore on, the physical pain began to give way to something worse, the psychological breakage. When you're alone in the ocean at night, the mind has nothing to anchor itself to. No horizon, no stars, just the roar of the wind and the hiss of the spray. The brain begins to fill the void. It manufactures data. Addie began to hear things. At first, it was just the wind sounding like a human voice, a scream, a shout. She would turn her head, salt encrusted in her eyes, looking for the source. Frank! She called his name. The wind tore the word from her mouth and scattered it. Then the hallucinations became more complex. She heard the ship's bell. Clang, clang, clang. It was ringing for dinner. It was ringing for church. It was ringing to tell her the voyage was over. She saw lights. Not the jagged flash of lightning, but warm yellow lights. The glow of a hearth. The street lamps of New York. She saw a ship, fully lit, sailing just beneath the waves, the passengers waving to her from behind glass windows. She wanted to go to them. It would be so easy. Just untie the knot. Just slip out of the shawl. The water wasn't cold anymore, it felt warm, inviting. The chests were heavy. They were hurting her. Why hold on to this hard? Cruel gold when she could float down to the lights. This is the siren song of hypothermia. It is the brain's final kindness, a chemical release to ease the passage into death. Addie was on the threshold. She stopped fighting the waves. She let her head loll forward, her cheek resting against the slimy, wet wood of the crate. She tasted the salt and the varnish. She closed her eyes. But the storm was not done with her. A rogue wave, larger than the rest, a mountain of black water, rose up out of the dark. It broke directly on top of her. The violence was absolute. It smashed the crates apart, straining the sash around her waist until it cut into her flesh. It drove her deep underwater, spinning her, thrashing her. The shock broke the trance. The water forced itself into her lungs, burning, violent. She gagged, she coughed. The pain returned, the cold returned. The warm lights vanished, replaced by the crushing reality of the Atlantic. She surfaced, gasping, screaming a silent scream into the gale. She was still tied to the gold. The knot had held. The cargo had refused to let her go. Dawn was coming. But it was not the dawn of a new day. It was the dawn of a new reality. The grey light filtered through the storm clouds, revealing the world she now inhabited. There was no ship. There was no land. There was only the endless, heaving grey hills of the ocean, stretching out to a blurred horizon, and floating around her like grave markers were the scattered remnants of the ship of gold. Her top hat, a wooden door, a child's doll, and Addie Easton, blue-lipped, skin-bleached white, battered and bruised, lashed to a fortune she could not spend, rising and falling in the vast, indifferent rhythm of the sea. She was the richest woman in the world and she was starving. She was the safest passenger and she was dying. The second day had begun, and the gold was still cold. The sun tried to break through the clouds, a pale, watery disk. It offered no warmth. It only offered visibility, and visibility was a curse, because now she could see that she was truly, utterly alone. The other voices were gone. The debris had scattered. It was just Addie and the machine of the ocean. She looked at the crate she was tied to. The stencil on the side was faded by the water, but she could make out the black letters. Wells Fargo & Co., a bank. She was tied to a bank. She laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound that hurt her throat. She laughed because if she didn't, she would scream, and she knew she didn't have the breath for screaming. She tightened her grip on the iron band. She laid her head back down on the wood. "Frank," she whispered. But Frank was gone. There was only the gold. And the gold did not answer. It just floated, indifferent, eternal, waiting for the next wave. This was the reality of the crisis. The systems of man, the insurance, the security, the value, had been stripped away. All that was left was the physics, buoyancy versus gravity, life versus entropy. And in the center of that equation, a woman was beginning to understand that the thing she was holding was not a treasure. It was a test. The human body is a miracle of engineering, but it is an engineering designed for land. It is built for gravity, for solid ground, for air that is dry and warm. When you submerge it in the Atlantic for 48 hours, the machinery begins to break down. It does not fail all at once like a steam engine. It fails in layers. By the second afternoon, Addie Easton was no longer the woman who had boarded the ship in Havana. She was becoming something else, a creature of the salt. The ocean was digesting her. The salt water had soaked into the wool of her dress, making it as abrasive as sandpaper. Every rise and fall of the swell rubbed the fabric against her skin, stripping away the outer layers. Her neck, her wrists, her waist where the sash was tied, they were raw, weeping wounds that the salt cauterized over and over again. But the thirst was worse. It is the cruelest paradox of the castaway. You are floating in water, endless, cool water, but you cannot touch it. It surrounds you. It wets your lips, but to drink it is to die. The salt concentration in seawater is higher than the salt in human blood. If you drink it, your cells try to balance the equation by rushing their own water out. You dehydrate faster. You burn from the inside. Addie's tongue had swollen. It filled her mouth like a foreign object, dry and cracked. Her lips were split, bleeding into the brine. In her delirium, the gold chest she was clinging to began to change. It wasn't wood and iron anymore. In the warping heat of the sun and the freezing days of the water, it looked like a table, a dining table. She found herself biting the wood. She gnawed on the corner of the crate, her teeth scraping against the iron banding. She tasted the metal. It tasted cold and sharp. It tasted like blood. It was a reality check. The pain in her teeth momentarily cleared the fog. "This is not a table," the pain said. "This is a box. You are in the ocean." The gold was testing her. It was a physical relationship now. The crate was her savior, yes, keeping her head above the foam. But it was also a brutal companion. As the sea remained choppy, the heavy box, laden with its dense cargo, had a different momentum than her body. When a wave lifted them, the box rose slower. When the wave dropped, the box fell faster. It slammed into her, again and again. The corner of the chest drove into her bruised ribs. It battered her thighs. It was a rhythmic beating administered by the fortune she was protecting. The capital was without mercy. It did not care that she was soft and it was hard. It simply obeyed the laws of physics. Addie cried out, but the sound was a croak. She tried to push the chest away to create a buffer, but she was tied to it. She had lashed herself to the machine of her own destruction. She was trapped in a violent embrace with $1 million. And then the weather turned again. The eye of the storm had passed, or perhaps a secondary squall line was moving through. The wind picked up. The waves, which had been rolling hills, began to break again. Whitecaps smashed into her face, forcing water up her nose. She was drowning by inches. The weight was too much. She had lashed herself to 2 crates, remember? 2 heavy chests of bullion. In the calm of the night, they had been stability. Now, in the chop, they were millstones. They were dragging her under, fighting against the buoyancy of the wood. She had to do the mathematics of survival. It is a cold calculus. What is the value of a human life versus the value of the cargo? On land, we say life is priceless. In the water, life is weight. Addie fumbled with the sash at her waist. Her fingers were white, wrinkled, and useless. They felt like sausages. She couldn't feel the fabric. She had to look at her hands to tell them what to do. "Pull," she commanded. "Twist." It took an eternity. Each wave interrupted her work, forcing her to clutch the wood and hold her breath. But slowly, agonizingly, the knot loosened. She wasn't untying herself from the raft. She was untying the raft from itself. She was separating the assets. With a final desperate tug, the wet fabric gave way. The second chest, the one she had snagged in the night, floated free. She watched it go. A chest filled with gold coins. Perhaps it held the life savings of 100 miners. Perhaps it held the payroll for a regiment of soldiers. It bobbed away from her, caught by a swell. It drifted for a moment, looking like a dark square of flotsam. And then, as if realizing it no longer had permission to float, it dipped. It didn't sink like a stone. It slid under the surface with a terrifying grace. One moment it was there, a tangible object of immense value. The next, it was gone. Just green water. Addie watched a fortune vanish into the abyss, and she felt lighter. The drag on her waist was gone. The bruising collisions stopped. She was left with one chest, one float, one chance. She had just discarded more wealth than she would ever see in 100 lifetimes, and all she felt was relief. The sun began to set on the second day. The ocean, satisfied with its violence, began to quiet down. This was the transition from the roar to the silence, and for a survivor the silence is often worse. The wind died. The waves smoothed out into long glassy undulations. The ocean became a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. The silence was absolute. No engines, no voices, no birds, just the gentle slap, slap, slap of water against the wood. In this silence, the mind breaks. You start to realize how small you are. The ocean is so vast that the human mind cannot comprehend it. You are a speck of dust on a mirror. The insignificance is crushing. Addie floated in the twilight. Her body was numb from the neck down. She wasn't cold anymore. She was past cold. She was existing in a state of suspended animation. She looked at the horizon, searching for a break in the line, and then she saw it. A shape, a hard geometric shape against the fading light, a vertical line. A mast, then a sail, a square of canvas, grey in the distance. A ship. Adrenaline, the body's last reserve, flooded her system. It woke her up. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs. She tried to shout. She opened her mouth and screamed, "Here, I am here." But nothing came out. Her throat was a ruin of salt and swelling. The sound was a hiss, a whisper of air. "Here!" She tried to wave. She tried to lift her arm, but her shoulder was locked. She managed to flop her hand against the side of the gold chest. Thump, thump. A pathetic wet sound. The ship was miles away, but it was moving. It was tacking across the wind. It seemed to be getting closer. She could see the dark hull now. She could see the white foam at its bow. They had to see her. She was right here. She was the center of the world. How could they not see the woman tied to the gold? The ship grew larger. She imagined the lookout in the crow's nest. She imagined the cry of "Man overboard." She imagined the warmth of blankets, the taste of fresh water. The hope was painful. It hurt more than the salt. But the ship did not slow down. It altered course, yes, but not toward her. It turned toward a large cluster of debris a half-mile to the south, a tangle of spars and rigging that looked from a distance like a lifeboat. Addie watched as the vessel sailed past her. She saw the figures of men on the deck, tiny silhouettes against the sky. They were looking at the water. They were scanning for survivors. But they were looking at the big things, the masts, the lifeboats, the wreckage. They did not see the single head bobbing just above the surface. They did not see the dark wood of the chest, which blended perfectly with the dark water of the dusk. She was invisible. The ship passed. The wake it created rolled toward her, lifting her gently, mocking her. She watched the stern of the vessel shrink. She watched the white sail turn into a grey square, then a dot, then nothing. The silence rushed back in. It was heavier now. It was the silence of a tomb. This is the moment where most people die, not from the cold but from the despair. The spirit breaks. The will to live is a flame, and hope is the oxygen. When the ship vanished, the oxygen was cut off. It would have been so easy to just untie the sash, to let the gold chest float away, to slip under the surface and breathe in the water. It would be over in a minute. Addie looked at the water. It was black now. Night had fallen. The stars were coming out, cold and distant, indifferent witnesses. She looked at the knot around her waist. It was loose. The fabric was fraying. She closed her eyes. She thought of the ship. She thought of the men who hadn't seen her. Anger is a strange fuel, but it burns hot. They hadn't seen her. They had left her. No. The word wasn't spoken, but it rang in her skull like a bell. No, she would not be a statistic. She would not be a piece of debris. She was Addie Easton. She had crossed the plains. She had survived the fever in Panama. She had survived the hurricane. She would not die because some lookout was blind. She reached down with her numb, clumsy hands. She grabbed the ends of the sash, and she pulled. She didn't untie it. She tightened it. She cinched the fabric until it dug into her waist, until it hurt. She retied the knots, jamming the wet wool together, fusing herself to the chest. She was making a commitment. She wrapped her arms around the gold. She laid her cheek against the wood. She wasn't hugging a fortune anymore. She wasn't hugging money. The value of the gold meant nothing. It was just matter. It was just a solid thing in a liquid world. "I am here," she whispered to the darkness. "I am still here." She shut down her mind. She stopped thinking about Frank. She stopped thinking about New York. She stopped thinking about thirst. She focused on one thing, the rhythm of the breath. In, out, in, out. She waited. The night was endless. The creatures of the deep brushed against her legs, fish, jellyfish, things she didn't want to name. She didn't flinch. She was part of the ocean now. She was a piece of drift that refused to sink. When the sky began to turn grey again, marking the beginning of the third day, Addie was still there. She was unconscious, her head lolling on the chest. Her hair fanned out in the water like seaweed, But the knot held, the gold held, and as the sun broke the horizon, casting a long golden road across the surface of the calm Atlantic, it illuminated a solitary figure. A woman, fused to a box, drifting in the immense empty blue. She had survived the fall. Now she just had to survive the rescue. The third day is when the ocean stops acting like a predator and starts acting like a solvent. The violence of the storm had passed, but in its place came a slow chemical dismantling of the human form. The Atlantic was no longer trying to drown Addie Easton. It was trying to dissolve her. We often romanticize the sea, we paint it blue and give it white caps. But to a body submerged for 70 hours, the sea is a caustic vat. The salt is not just a seasoning, it is a microscopic crystal, sharp and relentless. It had worked its way into the pores of Addie's skin. It had saturated the wool of her heavy Victorian dress until the fabric became a rigid, abrasive shell. Every subtle movement of the swell, every lift and fall of the chest she clung to, acted like a file. Her skin was peeling. It wasn't just sunburn, though the tropical sun beat down on her exposed face with the force of a hammer. It was immersion. The water was breaking down the cellular bonds. Her hands, still locked in a rigor mortis grip on the iron handles of the gold chest, were white and sodden, the skin wrinkling and sloughing off in pale strips. She was becoming less defined. The boundary between the woman and the water was blurring, and in this biological disintegration, her mind began to slip its moorings completely. We call it delirium, but that is too clinical a word. It was a separation of consciousness. Addie was no longer inside her body. She was floating above it, watching this strange, bloated creature tied to a box. She felt a bizarre pity for the woman in the water. Look at her, she thought. She looks so tired, why doesn't she just let go? The gold chest, the property of Wells Fargo & Co., had transformed again. In the first act of this tragedy, it was a lifeboat. In the second, it was a bruise. Now in the third act, it was an oven. The dark wood and the iron bands absorbed the midday heat. The metal grew hot to the touch. The thing keeping her afloat was now scorching her raw skin. This is the cruelty of capital without mercy. The gold does not care if you burn. It does not care if you bleed. It simply exists, dense and immutable. Addie rested her cheek against the hot iron. She didn't pull away. The pain was grounding. It was the only thing that felt real. The hallucinations returned, but they were no longer the frantic auditory shouts of the previous night. They were calm. They were domestic. She saw her kitchen in New York. She saw the dust motes dancing in the light of a window that didn't exist. She smelled roasting meat. She felt the texture of a linen napkin. She began to talk to the chest. She wasn't praying. She was negotiating. "If you let me go," she rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones, "I will give you the money, all of it." She was bargaining with a box of bullion. She was offering to pay the gold to let her live. It is the ultimate absurdity of the economic system. At the very end, when the markets have closed and the ledgers are wet, we still try to make a deal. But the chest just bobbed, silent and heavy, riding the long, oily swells. The afternoon wore on, stretching time into a thin, agonizing wire. The thirst was now a physical solid in her throat. Her tongue was too large for her mouth. She could feel the blood pulsing in her ears, a slow, thumping rhythm that sounded like footsteps. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was coming. She lifted her head. The movement sent a spike of agony down her spine. She scanned the horizon. It was empty. The line between sky and sea was hard and flat, but the thumping continued. It wasn't footsteps. It was the weather. The Atlantic is a restless machine. Even after a hurricane passes, the energy remains in the water. A new swell was building from the east. Darker clouds were stacking up on the horizon, bruising the blue sky. The ocean was taking a breath. The water grew choppy again. The gentle rocking turned into a violent jerk. The chest, having no flexibility, snapped against the tethers. The sash around Addie's waist, now buried deep in her sodden flesh, pulled tight. She gasped. The pain was blinding. It was as if the gold was trying to shake her off. "You have held on too long," it seemed to say. "You are bad for business. Let go." This was the crisis. This was the moment where the mathematics of survival demanded a subtraction. She had already let one chest go. Now, she had to decide if she could afford to keep this one. She looked at her hands. They were claws fused to the iron. She wasn't sure she could open them even if she wanted to. The muscles had locked. She was mechanically integrated into the cargo. But the mind was ready to resign. There is a phenomenon known to shipwreck survivors. It is the peace of surrender. It is the moment when the struggle becomes more painful than the inevitable. The water looks soft. The darkness looks like sleep. Addie looked down into the abyss beneath her feet. It was a deep, inviting blue. It went down for miles. Down there it was quiet. Down there she wouldn't have to fight the gravity of the gold. She stopped kicking. She let her legs hang limp. She let the weight of her dress pull her down. Her chin dipped below the surface. The salt water rushed into her nose. It didn't burn this time, it felt like a cool cloth. She sank lower. The water covered her eyes. The roar of the surface was muffled. The light turned green, then dim. She was leaving, she was finally going home. But then the chest jerked. A wave, larger than the others, caught the square edges of the box and heaved it upward. Because Addie was tied to it, she was yanked up with it. The sash bit into her waist, her head broke the surface. Air, hot, salty air, forced its way back into her lungs. She coughed. She gagged. The reflex was violent. Her body betrayed her desire to die. Her biology wanted to live, even if her mind was done. She hung there, gasping, weeping without tears, because she had no water left to cry. The gold had saved her again, but it felt like a punishment. It wouldn't let her die. It was holding her hostage in this purgatory of sun and salt. "Why?" she whispered. The sound was just a vibration in her throat. The sun began to dip. The third night was coming, and with the night came the terror of the void. But as the light faded, something shifted in the atmosphere. The wind died down. The chop settled. The ocean, having flexed its muscles one last time, went unnaturally still. It was the silence of a cathedral. The water became black glass. The stars came out, reflected perfectly on the surface, so that Addie felt she was floating in the center of a sphere of space. Stars above, stars below. No horizon. No gravity. In this cosmic silence, clarity returned. The hallucinations faded. The pain receded into a dull background hum. Addie Easton was left with the naked truth of her existence. She was a consciousness attached to a piece of wood. She was a single point of awareness in an infinite universe. She looked at the chest. In the starlight, she could see the rivets. She could see the grain of the wood. She realized with a sudden sharp lucidity that this chest was not her enemy. It was not her savior. It was just a thing. It was matter. And she was matter. She stopped thinking about the value of the contents. The gold bars inside, stamped with the seals of eagles and kings, were just ballast. They were stones. If the box had been empty, it would have floated too high, it would have flipped. The weight of the gold was keeping the center of gravity low. The wealth was useful only because it was heavy. She understood then that she was not protecting the gold. The gold was serving her. The hierarchy of the world had been inverted. In New York, men died for this metal. Here, the metal existed only to keep a woman's face 3 inches above the water. This realization brought a strange strength. It wasn't physical energy. She had none left. It was a resolve, a hardening of the spirit. "I will use you," she thought. "I will use you until you rot." She shifted her weight. She adjusted her grip. She found a rhythm with the gentle rise and fall of the breathing ocean. She was no longer fighting the sea. She was riding it. She became a sailor of a vessel made of one box. The night deepened. The cold returned, seeping into her marrow. But she welcomed it. The cold kept her awake. Sleep was death now. If she slept, her head would drop and she would inhale the Atlantic. So she stayed awake. She counted the stars. She counted the swells. She counted the beats of her own slowing heart. She thought about the ship that had passed her. The anger she had felt then was gone. It had burned out. Now there was only patience. She would wait. She would outwait the ocean. She would outwait the storm. She would outwait the gold. Dawn on the fourth day did not come with glory. It came with a grey, sickly light. The mist was thick, clinging to the water like smoke. Addie's eyes were crusted shut with salt. She had to pry them open with her facial muscles, cracking the dried brine. The world was grey, grey water, grey sky, grey wood. She was drifting. She didn't know where. She could have been 10 miles from the coast or 1,000 miles from nowhere. It didn't matter. Her world was 3 feet wide. She tried to move her legs. They were unresponsive, heavy logs dragging beneath her. She tried to move her fingers. They were fused to the iron. She was a statue carved from salt and pain. But she was breathing. Shallow, rasping breaths. In, out, and then a sound. Not the wind, not the water. A rhythmic, mechanical sound. A splashing, but regular. Splash, pause, splash, pause, oars. Addie's mind, sluggish and skeptical, rejected the data. It's a hallucination, she told herself. It's the kitchen again, it's the blood in your ears. But the sound grew louder, and with it a voice, a human voice, rough, loud, real, steady on the port side. It wasn't a whisper in her head, it was a vibration in the air. Addie tried to turn her head. Her neck was locked. She couldn't see. Panic, sudden and electric, shot through her. If she couldn't see them, they couldn't see her. She was a piece of driftwood. She was invisible. She needed to make a sound. She needed to scream. She gathered every ounce of air left in her collapsed lungs. She pushed against the diaphragm. She tried to form a word. Help. It came out as a hiss, a pathetic, leaking sound. The splashing continued. They were getting closer, but they were passing. They were going to miss her again. She tried to thrash. She tried to kick. Her body gave a convulsive shudder. Her hand, the one locked on the handle, slipped just an inch. The iron band scrapped against the bone. The pain was sharp enough to grant her 1 second of clarity. She slammed her free hand, the one that had been trailing in the water, against the side of the chest. Slap. It was a weak sound. But in the dead silence of the morning mist, it carried. The splashing stopped. "Hold water," the voice said. "Did you hear that?" Silence. Addie held her breath. The ocean held its breath. "Over there," another voice said. "Something floating. Looks like a crate." "Just debris," the first voice said. "Move on." "No." Addie threw her head back. She forced her cracked lips apart. She didn't try to speak, she just wailed. A low, guttural moan of pure misery. It was the sound of a ghost. "Jesus," the voice said. "It's alive." The splashing returned, frantic now. The sound of wood cutting through water. The mist swirled, and then a shape emerged from the grey. A longboat. Dark wood. Men in oilskins. They were rowing hard. The bow of the boat cut toward her. Addie watched them come. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel relief. She felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. She watched the man in the bow reach out with a boat hook. She saw the metal tip catch the iron handle of the gold chest. The connection was made. The drift was over. Hands reached down. Rough, calloused hands. They grabbed her shoulders. They grabbed her sash. They tried to pull her up, but she wouldn't move. She was tied to the gold, and her hands were locked on the handles. The men pulled, and the chest came up with her, dripping, heavy, monstrous. "She's lashed to it," a sailor shouted. "Cut her loose." A knife flashed in the grey light. The sash, the wool fabric that had been her lifeline and her torture, was sliced through. The tension snapped. For the first time in days, Addie was separated from the Fortune. They hauled her over the gunwale. She was heavy, waterlogged, limp. They laid her on the bottom boards of the boat, amidst the coils of rope and the feet of the sailors. She stared up at the sky. It was still grey, but it was a different grey. It was a ceiling she could survive under. "What about the box?" a sailor asked. He was looking over the side at the chest bobbing in the water, free now, drifting away. The officer in the stern looked at Addie, half dead on the floorboards, and then at the chest. He saw the markings. Wells Fargo. "Grab it," the officer said. The boat hook lashed out again. The gold was secured. It was hoisted aboard, thumping heavily onto the wood next to Addie's head. They lay there together. The woman and the wealth, Both rescued, both salvaged. Addie closed her eyes. The boat began to move. The rhythm of the oars was a lullaby. She didn't know if she would live. She didn't know if she would ever walk again. But she knew one thing. The ocean was behind her. And the gold was just luggage,